What's up guys, hope you're having a good day. In this video we're going to be taking a deep dive into each of the main card fights taking place this weekend at UFC 284 from a betting perspective. Hopefully if you're betting the fights this weekend you're going to get a lot of value out of the information that I'm going to be sharing with you, and if you do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below and also hit the bell notification. That'll enable you to get notifications whenever I drop a new breakdown video to YouTube. Speaking of breakdown videos, I was also wondering if you'd like to do a business deal. If this video gets 150 likes, I will drop a breakdown video to YouTube for the fight between Jake Paul and Tommy Fury. So as soon as this video hits 150 likes, that video is going to magically appear on YouTube. I will release it, and hopefully we could find a bet on the fight or figure out some of the most likely outcomes, how it's likely to go down. So if you want me to break down the fight between Tommy Fury, Jake Paul, hit the like button below. 150 likes, we are good to go. So before we get into the breakdowns this week, also just want to remind you guys to gamble responsibly. It is brutally difficult making money betting on sports, extremely difficult, and that's not the perception new gamblers especially get when they go onto Twitter and Instagram and they see everyone on there making loads of money, doing well betting sports, and everyone sounds like a pro gambler. We know it is extremely difficult making money on sports. It takes a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of experience, and as a result, it's very important to do your own research and gamble responsibly. Gamble very carefully on the fights this weekend. The information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video though is from hours and hours of research, so it's coming from a good place, and I've got a lot of years of experience doing this. I also earn a living live betting on the UFC, which brings me to my next point. We do still have a couple of spaces available in my live betting group. These spaces do not come up very often. We're pretty much sold out most of the year round, but at the moment there are a couple of spaces available. If you'd like to get into the live betting group, all you need to do is go to my website, MMABettingTips.com, link to that in the description below. You just need to go to where it says betting tips in the nav bar, click live betting tips here. You can sign up. If you don't like it, reach out to me, send me an email, DM, something like that. I can give you a refund, it's no problem. Spaces do not come up very often. We have to set a member cap on the number of people in the group, because obviously the more people that try to bet the same thing at the same time in live betting, the faster the odds become suspended. So even though that still happens with the bets we place, I set a cap on the number of people in the group to mitigate some of the impact of how much the odds do decline. So there's a couple of spaces available. I don't think they're going to be around for too much longer. This could be a last chance to jump on board for a while, so give it a try. What better time to try it than a fantastic event like this coming up this weekend? And on top of that, if you do like the breakdowns in this video for the main card, don't forget that you can get breakdown videos for all the other fights on this card, all of the prelim matchups, by heading on over to my website, MMABettingTips.com. Link for that in the description below. Enough of all the shilling. It's time to get into the first breakdown of the video, which is going to be the main event between Alexander Volkanovski and Islam Makhachev. Now, before we get into talking about how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, I want to make it really clear that I think Alexander Volkanovski is absolutely brilliant. I think he's the greatest featherweight of all time, and I think he's one of the very few fighters in the UFC that doesn't really have any weaknesses, which is quite rare. He's so well-rounded, he's so tough, so durable, great fight IQ, great game planning, great strategy, trains at a great gym, great cardio, tough. He's the total package, right? It's very difficult to find any flaws in Volkanovski. And I want to get that out of the way because I'm very conscious that when you have two elite guys like this, Volkanovski and Makhachev, obviously I've got to talk about the most likely outcome. And so I've got to talk about specific ways in which I think one guy is going to struggle. I often think people, mislead or misread, misunderstand me, and think that I'm not giving enough credit to some of these fighters when I actually think someone like Volkanovski is an absolutely brilliant fighter. One of the greatest featherweights ever, probably the greatest featherweight ever. But despite that, this is an extremely difficult matchup for him this weekend. And I do see Makhachev winning a very high percentage of the time for the reasons that I'll get into now. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds, we can see that Makhachev reflects the probability of him winning a high percentage of the time, because his average odds of around 1.26, which is minus 385, carry an implied probability of 85%. If we take a look at the odds on Volkanovski, he is around an average of 4.0, which is going to be plus 300 for an implied probability of 25%. So we've already said that Volkanovski is one of these guys that doesn't really have any weaknesses. So why am I so confident that Makhachev is going to win relatively comfortably if there's nothing that Volkanovski does badly? And the reason why I think this is such a tough fight for Volkanovski is quite simply the size difference. We've got weight classes for a reason, and I just think the size difference between these two is going to be too much for Volkanovski to overcome. Now, that's a very simplified explanation of why I think this is such a tough fight for Volkanovski. So let's dig a little bit deeper. If we look at the tail of the tape, we can see that Volkanovski is 34 years old, 5'6" with a 71.5-inch reach. Makhachev, 31 years old, 5'10" with a 70.5-inch reach. So when you look at the tail of the tape, there's nothing like crazy notable that jumps out. Both guys roughly the same age. And what's interesting is Volkanovski's actually got a 1-inch longer reach than Makhachev. So even though you've got a bit of a height difference between these two, with Volk being 5'6", Makhachev being 5'10", what's interesting is that it's Volkanovski, the smaller guy, with the reach advantage. And this is quite significant statistically, because statistics tell us that differences in height don't give a statistical advantage to the taller fighter, but differences in reach do give quite a substantial statistical advantage to the fighters with the longer reach. Now, a 1-inch reach differential is negligible in an MMA fight. Statistically, it doesn't really mean anything. But a height difference of 5'6" compared to 5'10" statistically doesn't really mean anything either, which is super interesting. So at this point, you're probably saying, or probably thinking to yourself, well, if Volkanovski doesn't have any weaknesses, and he's the best featherweight of all time, and he used to fight at used to fight at lightweight, and statistically the height difference doesn't mean anything, why are you so confident that Makhachev is going to get the job done this weekend? The reason why I'm pretty confident is because when it comes to size differences in MMA, one thing that we talk about a lot is a fighter's physicality. And what's interesting about this one is Volkanovski is a very physically imposing fighter in the featherweight division, but Makhachev, pound for pound, is probably the most physically imposing fighter next to Khabib and Chimaev that I've ever seen. And it is extremely difficult to stop someone as physically imposing and someone as technically skilled as Makhachev, to stop him from just grabbing a hold of you and doing whatever he wants to do. This is a really difficult fight for Volkanovski, because not only has he got to overcome that size difference, which would be difficult even if he were facing, a regular lightweight that had that size difference, just because the lightweight is just going to be the bigger man, but he's got to overcome that size difference against potentially pound for pound the most physically imposing fighter in the UFC. So that size difference between the two is just accentuated. And look, I know if you check out Makhachev's record, he hasn't fought any particularly physically imposing fighters, right? Ramos is physically imposing, but he wears down as the fight goes on. Tazrukian's also pretty small. And then these guys, for the most part, also not the most physically imposing lightweights. But it is very notable to me how no one has even come close to neutralizing Makhachev's physicality, apart from Arman Tazrukian, who also has the technique to back it up. He's also got that base in combat sambo. No disrespect to Volkanovski. He's brilliant. I love him to death. But I don't think he's going to be as technical or have the ability to scramble and defend himself in grappling positions as well as Arman Tazrukian could, simply because Volkanovski doesn't come from that combat sambo background that Tazrukian has to be able to somewhat defend himself and survive against the onslaught that Makhachev is bringing to the table. And before we move on to talking about how these two match up from a technical point of view, I just want to kind of highlight the size difference between these two. You know, if you stop the video here, you could just kind of see there's a huge difference in the head, the upper body, the shoulders of Makhachev. You can see that he's just a bigger man, just a bigger, physically imposing human being. And, you know, if these guys were roughly the same size, because of how high level of a grappler Makhachev is, this would already be a tough fight for Volkanovski. But with the size difference as well, it's just so difficult. Like, I will pause it here because this shot really highlights the size difference between these two. Like, look at the upper body, look at the shoulders, look at the neck, look at the head. The musculoskeletal system of Makhachev is just much bigger than Volkanovski's. And so, where we've seen Makhachev got this overwhelming physicality against other lightweights, imagine the physicality that he's going to bring to the table against someone that's 5'6" that fights in the featherweight division. It's a very difficult challenge for Volkanovski to overcome, and I just don't think he's going to be able to shut down the threat of Makhachev's grappling. I just don't think he's going to be strong enough. Not because he's not skilled enough, not because he's not good enough. I think it's simply just going to be a biological thing. He's just too small to compete with someone like Makhachev. It's just my opinion, but we'll get into talking about how these two match up stylistically. Big size difference between these two. Shout out to MMA Crazy as well for the video. Really appreciate them uploading that face-off. They were pretty much the only ones who had a video of it online, so they're doing the Lord's work. Really appreciate it, MMA Crazy. So if we consider how these two match up from a technical point of view, obviously Volkanovski's striking is brilliant. He is very good defensively. He's got great boxing, superb leg kicks. And what I really like about Volkanovski is that he fights at a high pace. He's constantly throwing, lands a high volume of strikes per round. When you look at Makhachev, he's nowhere near the level of striker that Volkanovski is. But Makhachev's style of striking does make him tricky for Volkanovski to deal with, because Makhachev's one of these guys that likes to be all the way outside the range where he can be hit, or all the way on the inside working for takedowns. And fighting at distance, you're not going to get a whole lot of boxing from Makhachev. He just likes to chip away at you with long range finding kicks. Now, that makes this a tricky stylistic matchup on the feet for Volkanovski, because the size difference between these two will make it a lot more difficult for Volkanovski to get his boxing going, which is really where his big advantage lies, on the feet. Volkanovski's going to have to bite down on his mouthpiece, come forward very aggressively and cover so much distance to get inside and land, which is not going to be an easy thing to do, because Makhachev doesn't like to engage. He likes to stay all the way outside of a range where he can be hit, kind of bouncing around, making himself a moving target, making himself very elusive. So it's going to be very, very tricky for Volkanovski to gain any momentum and have any success on the feet. He is the better striker than Makhachev, but Makhachev is very awkward and difficult to get to. One of the reasons why I think Makhachev wins this fight a crazy high percentage of the time is because when you've looked at, Makhachev in past fights against guys like Charles Oliveira as a good example, you can look at that fight and you can go, it is going to be difficult for Oliveira to deal with the physicality of Makhachev, but Oliveira is so dangerous everywhere that maybe he can catch Makhachev in like a crazy submission or knock him out, because we know Oliveira is very dangerous on the feet. He'll throw flying knees, spinning shit, and he's got true legit one-shot knockout power in every limb on his body, right? Oliveira's got great Muay Thai. If you look at Oliveira's record, the amount of people he's wobbled on the feet, knocked out, he's a vicious striker. When you look at Volkanovski, while he is a very high-level striker, he doesn't really have knockout power. He's one of these guys that breaks you down with volume and outworks you. If you look at his record, Yes, I know guys like Max Holloway, Jose Aldo, very, very difficult to finish because of how durable they are. But ever since Volkanovski came into the UFC, he has been a bit of a decisionator. You know, went to a decision here, went to a decision here, went to a decision here, 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 and here. And only has one finish in his last 6 fights. Now, I know it's impressive finishing Korean Zombie, but the finish also came from an accumulation of damage deep into the fight in round 4. The point I'm trying to make is, Volk is a volume striker. He doesn't really have that legit one-shot KO power. So can he catch Makhachev with something crazy and knock him out? Of course he can. It's MMA, anything can happen. But realistically, what's the probability of that happening? It's not very high, right? Volk is a volume striker. And so, for me, that significantly diminishes the probability that Volk wins this fight. Because it's not like he can catch Makhachev with something crazy. In order to win this fight, he's going to have to match the grappling and the physicality of Makhachev and find a way to outwork Makhachev. I just do not see how he's going to be able to do that. If Volkanovski had crazy knockout power like a Michael Chandler or a Justin Gaethje or a Charles Oliveira, I'd be like, you know what? Volk is a live dog in this one because, you know, he's likely going to have some success, especially early, neutralizing the threat of Makhachev's grappling. And the longer he keeps the fight on the feet, the more chance there is, you know, he lands a bomb on Makhachev. But I just don't think he's going to have the power to hurt a bigger human being like Makhachev. Like, if Volk is struggling to knock out featherweights, I can't see his power increasing or like carrying over that well to lightweight. You know, a really good example would be when Max Holloway fought Dustin Poirier. Holloway teed off on Poirier, landed absolute bombs and just couldn't hurt him because he just was too small. And that step up from featherweight to lightweight was just too big of a jump in terms of physicality. I know Volk is a whole different beast to Holloway, but you guys get the point I'm trying to make. Volk is just a smaller human being than Makhachev. So on the feet, I'm sure Volk probably will outstrike Makhachev, but I don't think he's going to have like a notable amount of success because the size difference will make it difficult for him to land impactful shots on Makhachev and get to Makhachev with how elusive he is with his footwork and movement. Which brings us on to grappling. And I'll be completely honest with you. When it comes to Islam Makhachev, I think he is, next to Chimaev, the best MMA grappler I've ever seen. I've been watching MMA for 20 years now. I've been betting on MMA for 14 years. And I've never seen anyone that has the combination of cardio, physicality, and technique that Makhachev does. He's absolutely brilliant. Now, I know there will be people rush into the comment section to call me a clueless idiot, but please, before you do that, just hear me out. Because I know there's two camps of people out there at the moment when it comes to Makhachev. There's the camp of people that don't... There's the camp of people that think Makhachev is overrated because he hasn't fought anyone. And look, it's tough to argue with the fact he hasn't fought anyone, right? He's dodged a lot of the top tier lightweights, right? There's no doubt about it. He had a relatively easy run to the title. I'm not going to argue against that. But then there's the other camp of people who think he's something extremely special. And I'm definitely in that camp. And the reason why I'm in that camp is because I don't think you need to see fighters face a certain level of opponent to gauge how good they are. I'm firmly of the belief that you can see just by the way a fighter moves, the way they carry themselves, their technique, their physicality. I believe no matter what level of fighter they're competing against, you can see the level of someone. And when I look at Makhachev, for me, I don't need to see him against the top tier best lightweights in the world to know this guy is as good as it gets when it comes to MMA grappling. Because the way I look at sports is, as time moves on, athletes get better and better and better, and the current generation of athletes is always going to be better than the previous generation of athletes. If you look at like the GOATs in football, like Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, they're a lot better than previous GOATs like Diego Maradona, because their strength and conditioning's better, their nutrition's better, their training's better, you know, their knowledge is better. As time moves on, you know, we learn more about, you know, how to compete at a high level. And I think you definitely see the same thing with MMA as well. I think Khabib Nurmagomedov is the greatest fighter of all time. But I think Makhachev is going to be a lot better than Khabib if he isn't already. Because Makhachev can learn through Khabib's mistakes. You know, you think about how difficult it would have been for Khabib to go from, you know, growing up, living and training in the mountains of Dagestan, to working his way into a position to be, you know, one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time. Think about all the mistakes he would have made, all the, you know, all the problems he had to solve, all the injuries he had to go through, you know, all the training issues he had to overcome. Makhachev can avoid a lot of the problems that Khabib ran into through learning through Khabib. He can learn from the mistakes. You know, his team is now going to know the optimum way to run a training camp. They're going to know the best diet, the best strength and conditioning program, the best game plans, the best strategies. Whereas when you're doing everything from the first time, you've got to learn through making mistakes. So Makhachev's career trajectory can be very steep here, and he can achieve great things a lot faster than Khabib can, just through learning through Khabib's mistakes. And when you look at Makhachev, I think when you observe his technique, clues are kind of there that he might already be better than Khabib. Because if you look at their striking, Khabib was never the most comfortable on the feet, would never read his opponents particularly well, whereas Makhachev is light on his feet, he moves well, much better technically. If you look at Khabib's grappling, he was very physically imposing, very methodical in the way that he worked through positions. But then you look at Makhachev, he's got that same crushing physicality, but almost like with really fast jiu-jitsu to go with it. You know, fast transitions, a very fast submission game. You know, Khabib, of course, had tons of submissions on his record, but it tended to be through wearing guys down and breaking them down with damage, breaking their will, and then they would give up a submission. Makhachev is the kind of guy that can, you know, catch you with a submission out of nowhere in a split second. You make a mistake on the ground. So I really think Makhachev is something extremely special. And I'm not saying that Volkanovski isn't something extremely special as well, but the difference is Makhachev is extremely special with the big size and physicality advantage to go with it. So when I look at how these two match up stylistically, I just do not see how Volkanovski is going to be able to stop Makhachev from imposing a grappling heavy game plan. Once Makhachev closes the distance and grabs a hold of Volkanovski, I don't see how Volk is going to be able to stop Makhachev from doing whatever he wants to do. And Volk may stuff the first few takedowns. You know, he may work his way back up to his feet a few times early. You know, he may have some success early. But the thing with Makhachev and all great MMA grapplers, Chimaev, you know, guys like Khabib, the thing that makes them great is that they do not stop coming. They do not get deterred by you neutralizing their grappling. And so even if Volk has success early, I just don't see him being able to stop Makhachev from imposing himself at some point in this fight. And it's a brutally difficult fight for Volkanovski. I would love to see him get it done, but it is not going to be easy. And I do think Makhachev is absolutely incredible, and I think he'll take another big step forward this weekend, improving to everyone, all the doubters, just how special he is. I could be wrong, but that's just how I see it playing out. So how do we look at this fight from a betting point of view? Well, with Makhachev being such a big favourite, there's really not that much upside in betting on him. You know, you'd have to put up a lot of money to get any kind of meaningful return. That doesn't interest me. If you really want to bet this fight, you know, in terms of money line, I would go with Volkanovski, I guess. But it's one of those things where I really do feel he needs a miracle in order to win. And with the size difference, it's going to be as close to impossible as it gets to submit Makhachev. And with Volk lacking that, true one-shot KO power, the chances of a flash KO aren't that likely either. So I just don't see how Volk wins this unless I've completely read the fight wrong. So, tricky fight for moneyline betting, but that's how I see it. Now, in terms of the over-under on this one, what I would do is look for kind of like the sweet spot. So we know both these guys are tough as nails. We know they're both durable as hell. So while I do expect Makhachev to dominate, it isn't going to be easy to get Volkanovski out of there. If I were looking at the over-under on this one, the one that jumps out at me is over 2.5 rounds at odds of 1.67. Makhachev is very, very good, but Volkanovski's very tough. We saw in the Ortega fight the position that Ortega had him in, and Volkanovski just refused to tap. He's the kind of guy you have to practically kill in order to finish. So despite how tough of a fight this is, I do see Volkanovski, going relatively deep in this matchup, and as a result, over 2.5 rounds is not a bad bet. It's probably not something that I'm going to be betting just because I rate Makhachev that highly. I wouldn't rule him out, just taking Volk down and totally dominating him on the ground. But we do want to go with the over-under. I think the over 2.5 rounds probably the best one, probably the sweet spot for you. In terms of prop bets, it is tricky because Makhachev to win inside the distance is in the even money odds range. So the odds on that are terrible. I do think that is the most likely outcome, but the odds are very, very bad. The odds also aren't great on Makhachev to win by decision as it happens. The odds to win by submission are also pretty terrible, especially with how difficult it is to make Volk tap. Best prop bet on this one is probably Makhachev to win by knockout or TKO. Not because I think it is particularly likely that he's going to knock Volk out. I don't think he's going to knock Volk out. But obviously, if he were to get a stoppage through ground and pound, that would be classed as a win by knockout or TKO. And with how difficult it was for Ortega to submit Volkanovski, the only way Makhachev could get a finish in this one, I guess, is if he were to kind of trap Volk in a bad position on the ground and put Volk in a position where the ref has to step in and stop it just because Volk can't defend himself from the ground and pound because of the position Makhachev put him in. If Volk is too stubborn to tap to a submission, then maybe Makhachev gets it done by knockout or TKO via ground and pound. But to be honest with you, I don't like any of the props on that fight, and I'm not going to be betting any of them myself. I think the odds are pretty stingy, pretty tight, pretty much where they should be. So I hope you found that useful. But I know there are a lot of big Volkanovski fans out there, so let me know if you think I'm dead wrong on this one in the comments below. Now let's break down the co-main event between Josh Emmett and Yair Rodriguez. So we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. We can see that Yair Rodriguez is a relatively big favourite at average odds of around 1.61, which is going to be minus 164 for an implied probability of 62%. We take a look at the odds on Josh Emmett. He is around an average of 2.35, which is going to be plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So in the eyes of the bookies, this one is very close to 60-40 in favour of Mr. Rodriguez. So Josh Emmett is 37 years old, 5'6" with a 70-inch reach, and Yair Rodriguez is 30 years old, 5'11" with a 71-inch reach. So what's interesting about this fight is it kind of highlights the point that I'm making about physicality in the matchup between Makhachev and Volkanovski. Because when you look at the tail of the tape between these two, we've got Emmett, who is pretty much the exact same size as Volkanovski, right? Both guys are 5'6" with around a 70-inch reach. And then you've got Rodriguez, who's 5'11" with a 71-inch reach. And we know Makhachev is 5'10" with a 70.5-inch reach. So Emmett is pretty much the same size as Volkanovski. Rodriguez, pretty much the same size as Makhachev. But we know that physicality isn't determined by your size and your wingspan. Physicality is determined by your physicality, right? So what's interesting is, in the matchup between Volkanovski and Makhachev, Makhachev has got that clear edge when it comes to physicality, and he's the bigger man to go with it. He's got the size advantage to go with it. What's interesting about this fight is Emmett is a lot more physically imposing than Rodriguez. Emmett has physicality on his side, but he's the smaller fighter out of him and Rodriguez. So you can see that, you know, physicality isn't always tied to a size advantage, but when you have a size advantage and the physicality to go with it, that's when you really have a huge edge over your opponent. And so just thought that was kind of interesting with how, you know, all four fighters in the main event have got, you know, similarities between their size and wingspan, but with very different levels of physicality to go with it. The only other X factor to really talk about on this one is the age. Emmett, at 37 years old, is very old for a featherweight. He's going to be 38 years old next month. And we know that the lighter weight classes, you know, tend to see fighters decline, you know, much sooner in their careers than the heavier weight classes. So 38 years old for a featherweight is very, very old. You know, it's probably like the equivalent of a fighter being in their early 40s in the light heavyweight division. So Emmett is definitely at the tail end of his career. He's going to be declining from fight to fight. And on top of that, Emmett's also a guy that has had a lot of significant injuries over the last few years. You know, I remember in his UFC debut against, I think it was John Tuck. The reason why that fight went to a split decision is because he threw a punch and broke his hand, but the break was significant to the point where he actually had a compound fracture and the bone was sticking out of his hand. So he essentially toughed it out somehow and was able to win the fight with one hand. I mean, I would have been rolling around on the floor, bawling my eyes out in agony. But Emma is, you know, incredibly tough, was able to dog it out and get a win. But that's just, you know, the first significant injury that he suffered in a long line of significant injuries. You know, you had the fight against Jeremy Stevens where his skull was basically cracked and crushed. And I know he's had some significant knee injuries over the last few years as well. So 20 pro fights. He's been in a lot of wars. He's taken a lot of damage. I mean, look at the amount of damage that he took in his last fight against Calvin Kattar. You know, it's not easy for a 38-year-old guy to take those kind of shots, you know, suffer that kind of damage, go through those kind of wars, and not decline significantly afterward. What I do like about Josh Emmett is that he does take long breaks in between fights, sometimes forced through injury. You know, other times I'm sure just to kind of heal up and take a break. If you look at his record over the last sort of, you know, 3 years, he has had like a year or so in between fights, 6 months to a year, which gives his body time to heal, which he definitely needs from these injuries, these wars that he's been in. But make no mistake, Yair and Emmett are on opposite career trajectories. At almost 38 years old, Emmett is going to be on a steep decline, getting worse and worse from fight to fight. Rodriguez, 30 years old, in his prime, nowhere near as many miles on the clock, nowhere near as many injuries, nowhere near as much damage. He's going to be getting better and better from fight to fight. And I think we've seen this. You know, the rate of improvement from Rodriguez is significant. You know, when he made his return back in 2021 against Max Holloway, he looked exponentially better than the version of Yair Rodriguez we'd seen prior to that. So Rodriguez is a guy making big improvements from fight to fight, and as a result, he's on the up and up. Emmett is on the down and down. And statistically, with Emmett being around 8 years older than Rodriguez, that would give Rodriguez statistically around about a 67% chance of winning. So that is also something notable to pay attention to. Now, even though most of the X factors go in favor of Rodriguez in this one, we've always got to, you know, assess how both fighters matchup from a stylistic point of view, and then look at the odds to see which fighter is going to give us the better risk to reward ratio if we wanted to bet the fight. Sometimes you'll find a fight where there's clearly an incredible amount of value in the odds. A good recent example of this was when we bet on Jamahal Hill to beat Glover Teixeira. If you would have just taken an hour out of your day to do some fight research on that matchup, you would have seen that in the even money odds range, Jamahal Hill was a brilliant bet. And so every once in a while, you will find fights like that. And we have got a fight in a moment that I'll talk to you about where I think there's a really good amount of value on a fighter this weekend. But when it comes to fights like this, you've really got to consider how they match up stylistically, look at the odds, and then see if there's any value in the odds, right? That's the game that we're playing. So while Rodriguez does have a lot of advantages in terms of X factors, youth, etc., I do think this is potentially a very difficult stylistic matchup for Rodriguez. And if you do want to bet this fight, I do feel Emmett at underdog odds is going to give you the better risk to reward ratio. There are things that Emmett does really well, which I think are likely to cause Rodriguez big problems. So if you think about the fighting styles of both guys, they're both primarily strikers. And what we notice from the two is that Rodriguez, while his boxing has improved tremendously, for the most part, he is still a kicks-based style of striker. So Rodriguez likes to stay on the outside with his hands down low, chin up high, and he likes to use his footwork, his movement, his high-level striking to just chip away at you from the outside. And he does favour kicks, but his boxing is getting a lot better. The problem with Rodriguez's style is that he does burn through a lot of energy with everything that he does, because Rodriguez throws a lot of big impactful kicks, he throws a lot of spinning attacks, a lot of flying attacks, and one of the things that makes Rodriguez so special is his footwork and movement. But when you're moving around the octagon a lot, you also burn through a lot of energy. And so what you tend to see from Rodriguez is early in the fight, he's very sharp, he's very technical, he moves very well, and he's got a lot of pop in his shots. He lands really impactful strikes. But the longer the fight goes, the flatter his footwork becomes. And when his footwork becomes flatter, he's less explosive and less dangerous offensively. And he also becomes a lot easier to hit. So Rodriguez is one of these guys that looks phenomenal in round one, but in every round after that, he becomes significantly less effective. When you look at a guy like Josh Emmett, he has the complete opposite style from a guy like Rodriguez. Rodriguez wants to stay on the outside, counter-strike, react to everything you're doing, and light you up with a really diverse range of attacks. Emmett wants to use his power and physicality to take control of the centre of the octagon, put you on the back foot, and use blitzing attacks to overwhelm you in the hope that he'll land one big shot that'll hurt you very, very bad. Because this guy, we've already spoken about his physicality. He's got crazy power in the featherweight division, and he's tough, he's scrappy, he's durable. So what you're likely to see in this matchup is Emmett coming forward being the aggressor. And Emmett is not the aggressor in the same way that you'd see Volkanovski be the aggressor. Because when you look at a guy like Volkanovski or Parker Porter that we're going to be talking about in a bit, or Jack Della Madalena, who's probably the best example of all, these guys like to come forward, put you on the back foot, put you into a defensive shell, and take control and charge of the fight through their output and work rate. And they throw a very high volume of strikes. Emmett doesn't do that. He relies on you respecting his power enough to allow him to dictate the pace. So he'll come forward, take control of the centre of the octagon, he'll attack you with some blitzing combinations, and basically hopes that you will allow him to dictate the pace once you feel how dangerous he is. Typically speaking, Rodriguez doesn't play that game. Rodriguez is a high volume striker that is constantly peppering his opponents with a very diverse range of attacks, elbows, spinning attacks, all kinds of kicks, boxing. And so on the feet, I do think you'll see Rodriguez outstrike Emmett by a wide margin. Even though there's not that much of a difference in reach, I do think, Rodriguez is going to be able to use his length to just chip away at Emmett and rack up big volume and probably inflict a good amount of damage on Emmett. The problem with Rodriguez is that early in a fight, he lands very snappy, impactful, damaging shots. But as the fight progresses, sort of into that 3rd, 4th and 5th round, he becomes quite sloppy and he's not able to land with the same impactfulness. Now, of course, he's always capable of doing some crazy shit like that spinning attack or spinning elbow he landed on Korean Zombie late in the fight. It's always possible. But as the fight progresses, Rodriguez becomes a lot easier to deal with. I mean, a really good example of this are his fights against Max Holloway and Jeremy Stephens, where we start off with the Stephens fight. If you go back and watch that fight, in the first half of the matchup, he lights Jeremy Stephens up bad, real bad. Hurts him bad, outstrikes him by a huge margin, totally outclasses Stephens. But then runs into trouble in the second half of the fight because as his strikes and his footwork become flatter, he isn't able to back Stephens up and get as much respect in there. So Stephens was able to get inside, get him down, beat him up on the ground. And the same thing happened in the Max Holloway fight. If you go back and watch that matchup, the first couple of rounds, Rodriguez causes Holloway huge problems. But in the second half of that fight, when Rodriguez becomes flatter, Holloway is able to get inside easier, get his boxing going, and also use some grappling to take Rodriguez down and wear him down. And I could really see the same thing happening with Josh Emmett. When you look at Josh Emmett, we know that he's very smart. He's one of these very tactical, strategic fighters, like a lot of guys that come out of Team Alpha Male are. It was a very controversial decision that he won against Calvin Kattar. But one of the reasons why he was so successful against Calvin Kattar was because he understood the importance of stealing rounds. So in that fight, you would have, these really close competitive rounds that Kattar would definitely win. Kattar was definitely outstriking Emmett in the majority of those rounds. But Emmett was smart enough to know that judges are often influenced by which fighter finishes a round stronger. And so Emmett was very streetwise. And if you go back and watch that fight, what you'll notice is, for the most part, in most of those rounds, Emmett made a conscious decision to finish every single round very strong, which enabled him to steal some of those rounds from Kattar, which should probably have been scored for Kattar. But this is the game that fighters play, right? And we know the judges fall for tricks like that all the time. So that's quite notable to me, because when Rodriguez does start to become flat and slow down, it is going to be easy to steal rounds from him. And one of the ways that you can do that is with takedowns and grappling. We don't see a whole lot of grappling from Josh Emmett. The guy prefers to stand and strike, but we do know he's got good offensive wrestling. He's trained at a predominantly grappling-based gym, Team Alpha Male, for the majority of his career. And with his body type being small, muscular and compact, when he shoots in on a longer, skinnier guy like Rodriguez, naturally he's going to be in on the hips and legs of Rodriguez. And what I've noticed about Rodriguez is that his takedown offense is pretty good early in a fight, but the longer it goes, the easier he becomes to take down. So this is one of those matchups where I do see Rodriguez doing pretty well early on, but if he doesn't get an early knockout, if he doesn't get Emmett out of there quickly, I think into that 3rd, 4th and 5th round, you'll start to see Emmett take over. And I also want to use this moment as an opportunity to say it is also possible that Emmett will slow down in this fight. But if both guys slow down and become tired, Emmett's got his grappling to fall back on, and he still has good impactfulness in his shots when he gets tired, whereas Rodriguez becomes significantly less effective at everything he does when he gets tired. Now, as we summarize this one, I also just want to re-emphasize the point that a 30-year-old guy in his prime should have more energy than a 38-year-old fighter who should be declining big time from fight to fight. So when I present this information to you, it's based on their recent performances. And based on their recent performances, I think Emmett can outwork Rodriguez late on and get a late finish or backdoor a decision late on. But that doesn't mean that this weekend at 30 years old, 38 years old, Father Time isn't going to suddenly punch Emmett in the dick. And this weekend, Emmett will look really bad and get absolutely destroyed. Because if we're being realistic, it's not very often statistically that 38-year-old fighters who are at the stage in their career where, you know, they're very close to retirement beat these young, hungry bulls in their prime like Yair Rodriguez. So based on recent performances, I do think Emmett is more likely to win, which is why I think at dog odds, he is the side to be on. I think he definitely gives you the better risk to reward ratio. But just know, whenever you're betting on a 38-year-old against a guy in their prime, very likely that, you know, they could just show up and perform really bad and get flash KO'd or become really tired themselves, even if their recent performances doesn't show us all that likely. So it's a great fight, but I do think the power, the physicality of Emmett will be too much for Rodriguez to deal with in the second half of the fight when Rodriguez starts to slow and become sloppy. I hope you found that useful. So we can now go through the over-under and also the prop bets for this fight. So we take a look at the over-under. Again, this is one of those situations where I think the less likely outcome is going to give you a better risk to reward ratio. So when you look at the odds on this one, it's quite clear that the odds are heavily favouring this fight to go quite deep. Now, I do get that. If you look at, you know, Josh Emmett's record, his last 3 fights have gone to a decision. If you look at Rodriguez's record, you know, he's gone the distance against, you know, 2 pretty tough opponents like Jeremy Stephens, Max Holloway. Went very deep with Korean Zombie, was 1 second away from going to a decision. So when you look at the odds on the over-under, it kind of makes sense that the fight going to a decision is favoured because of how frequently both Emmett and Rodriguez go to a decision. However, I think both these guys are so dangerous and both of them are so aggressive on the feet that betting on the under probably gives you the better risk to reward ratio. Because if you look at the over 4.5 rounds at 1.50 minus 200, those odds carry an implied probability of around 67%. That's pretty steep. Whereas if you look at the odds on the under around about 2.55, which is going to be plus 155 for an implied probability of 39%. If I look at a fight like this, I honestly think it's 50-50 whether it'll go the distance or not, simply because Emmett has big power in his hands. You know, he rocks, drops, wobbled many of the guys that he faces, and we know as the fight wears on, Rodriguez gets sloppier and easier to hit. So, you know, could see Emmett land a bomb and knock Rodriguez out. On the flip side, we know how dangerous Yair Rodriguez is, right? Throws a really diverse range of strikes, legit one-shot knockout power in every limb on his body. And with Emmett being 38 years old, you know, coming into this fight on the back of a war against Calvin Kattar, we've said he's had his face crushed by Jeremy Stephens over the last 2-3 years. He's got a lot of miles on the clock. It's probably not going to take much to knock out a 38-year-old Josh Emmett. So even though I guess it is more likely the fight will go the distance, I think if you do want to bet the over-under on this one, I think the under gives you a far better risk to reward ratio. I'm not going to be betting it personally, but that would be my advice to you. Obviously, do your own research. In terms of prop bets on this one, it's kind of tricky. I do think, you know, there's a reasonably good chance one of these guys scores a knockout. I just don't think the odds are particularly good on either of them winning by knockout or TKO. So prop bets, a little bit dead on this one. To me, I would probably give it a miss. If you wanted to just sprinkle some bets on this fight to make watching it more interesting, maybe go for like Emmett round 4 at odds of 26.0 plus 2,500, or Emmett round 5, 29.0 plus 2,800. Obviously, they're not particularly likely to hit. They're not, bets like that aren't going to win a super high percentage of the time. But knowing how dangerous Emmett still is late on, knowing how much Rodriguez slows at times, that might not be a bad one to go for. And if you wanted to kind of fade Emmett's age and chin, instead of going specifically for Emmett to win in round 4 or 5, you could limit some of the risk and bet on just the fight ends in round 4 or 5, on the basis that Yair might land something crazy late on, or maybe Emmett doesn't show up and look as good as he usually does because his age finally catches up with him. So yeah, those props probably better to go for actually than Emmett to win in round 4 or 5. I'd probably just go for the fight to end in round 4 or 5. Long shot prop bets, but I do think there's probably a bit of value there. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is Jack Della Madalena against Randy Brown. Now, when I saw that this fight had first been announced, I got pretty excited because I felt that it would be a very good stylistic matchup for Madalena, and I felt that he would be a very good bet. Unfortunately, I was very disappointed when I saw that he was a big favourite on the opening odds, because obviously, even if you do think Madalena is likely to win this fight a very high percentage of the time, his advantages are most likely reflected in these odds, with him being, around about a 1.30 favourite, which is minus 303 for an implied probability of 77%. Very difficult to find value betting on fighters in this odds range in a sport as chaotic as MMA, where anything can happen. I'm sure there are some people out there that do it, but it is very, very difficult because obviously, you just take 2 or 3 consecutive losses in a short space of time betting fighters in this odds range at level stakes, and you've got to win a hell of a lot of bets just to get back to break even. And we know disqualifications happen, fighters underperform all the time, they get flash KO'd. No matter how confident you feel in a fighter, you can never feel confident enough that they've got pretty much no chance of losing, which is basically what you need to feel in order to justify betting fighters in this odds range, because a 77% implied probability commands that level of confidence from you. So I felt this was one of those matchups where I was going to feel like Madalena was super likely to win, but I wouldn't be able to bet him because he was too big of a favourite. But what actually happened when I researched this matchup was that I ended up giving Randy Brown much more of a chance of winning this fight than I thought I would, which is really interesting, and I'll explain to you why. So if we take a look at the odds on Brown, we can see that he's around about a 3.60 underdog, which is plus 260 for an implied probability of 28%. So Madalena is 26 years old, 5'11", with a 73-inch reach, and Randy Brown, 32 years old, 6'3", with a 78-inch reach. So there are a few X factors for us to dig into here. The first one being their age. There's a 6-year age gap between these two, so that doesn't really give either guy an advantage. But what I will say about both these fighters is that they're both making huge improvements from fight to fight. We talk a lot about how young, hungry, up-and-coming fighters should be making big improvements because they're going to be training hard in the gym, constantly learning, and you really see that in Madalena and Brown. Every time we see these two guys, they just take a giant leap forward and get exponentially better. So that does add an element of risk and an element of uncertainty to betting this fight, because we're not going to be able to gauge the level of improvement we're going to see from both these guys. So either one of them or both of them could show up with an entirely new set of skills we haven't seen from them before, which would obviously change how we feel about how these two match up stylistically. Now, out of the two, that's more likely to happen with Madalena because he's younger, at 26 years old. He's going to be learning and improving at a more rapid rate than Randy Brown, who's been around a while now, 32 years old. But Brown is still absolutely for sure making big improvements from fight to fight. And Brown is virtually unrecognizable from the version of himself just 3-4 years ago. Which is interesting because if Randy Brown is much better now at 32 years old than he was at just 27, 28 years old, then it shows that at 26 how much improvement Madalena can do in the future and how much improvement he may have made coming into this fight this weekend. The other X factor to take into consideration is that Madalena has got home advantage on his side. Obviously, this card taking place in Australia. Madalena is Australian, and while I don't think it's that likely this fight will go the distance, because Madalena is very dangerous, very aggressive, he likes to drag guys into these stand-up wars, I do think a finish is more likely in this matchup. Having said that, if the fight did go to a decision and it was relatively competitive, with Madalena having home advantage, you'd expect the judges to lean his way. But on top of that, we also know that with Madalena being an exciting fighter that likes to put on a show for the crowd are going to be right behind him this weekend. So he's the kind of guy that's going to feed off the energy of the crowd and be energized by the crowd, which could spur him on to perform even better. Whereas the atmosphere may throw Randy Brown off his game because it's likely to be quite hostile towards him. So home advantage, something else for us to think about. We've also got to consider the size difference between these two. Madalena's 5'11" with a 73-inch reach. Brown 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. And what I really like about Randy Brown is that he does a really good job of using his size and length. He's one of these guys that doesn't panic when under pressure and uses his length effectively to do a really good job of counter-striking his opponents. So that height difference, that 5-inch reach advantage is really going to help Brown do what he does best in this matchup, which is play the role of matador, stay on the outside, and pick guys off from a safe distance using his length, which is exactly what he's going to need to do to beat Madalena, and pretty much exactly what he's done to beat guys who are, kind of similar in style to Madalena, such as Jared Gooden and Chaos Williams, the kind of guys that just like to come forward with loads of pressure, loads of aggression, big power punches, and just look to put it on, put it on Brown and pressure him to fight in an uncomfortable range. So we've seen Brown face a similar style to Madalena and do pretty well, but obviously Madalena is another level up now from the likes of guys like Chaos Williams, and the fight between Brown and Chaos Williams was pretty damn competitive. So we'll have to see, if Madalena can go one step further and actually beat Brown, where Chaos Williams kind of struggled, mainly due to, I feel, the fact that Williams doesn't throw with as high a volume as Madalena, and he certainly doesn't have the level of technique either. So if we look at how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, we can talk about grappling, pretty quickly, go over that, because obviously with both these guys primarily being strikers, you would expect this to be, for the most part, a stand-up fight, which is where we should focus most of our energy. But if this fight were to go to the ground, from a technical point of view, you would have to give Randy Brown the edge. He's got nasty submissions, he's got long limbs, long legs, long arms, which means he's got, a nasty choking game, slick back takes, pretty nasty submission game. Brown's problem is, because he's long and lean and tall, he lacks physicality on the ground. So he's pretty easy to take down, pretty easy to hold down. But if he gets on top of you, if he gets to your back, if he jumps on a choke, he's extremely dangerous. And what I would say about Madalena is that even though he's probably got more physicality on the ground, he might even be a better MMA wrestler than Randy Brown, who is predominantly a BJJ guy on the ground. What I would say about Madalena is his ground game is very green. He does take a lot of risks. He's the kind of guy that you've got to practically kill in order to finish. He's tough as nails. I mean, look at his nose. You can see this guy is not he's not afraid of getting into some wars. And we saw him survive some pretty deep chokes in his fight against Ramazan Emmett. But he isn't the most skilled on the ground. For the most part, he's a striker, stand-up fighter. That's where his strengths lie. And if this fight were to go to the ground, I do worry for Madalena because of how slick Brown is with his submission game. Now, having said that, Madalena is one of these guys that, while his takedown defense isn't great, he is a strong, powerful, athletic dude. And it's not easy to upset his balance and take him down. Definitely not easy to hold him down because of how physically strong he is. And Brown isn't the best offensive wrestler, so he's got a slick submission game, but he's not particularly good at getting his opponents to the ground, and you'll rarely see him shoot a takedown. So Madalena rarely tries to take his opponents down. Brown rarely tries to take his opponents down. For that reason, I doubt this fight is going to go to the ground. But if it does, you'd have to give Brown the advantage because of his slick submission game. I think Madalena could be in some trouble if this one hit the ground. But in a stand-up fight, it's a super interesting stylistic matchup because the range that both these guys want to fight in will allow the other to do exactly what they want to do. Because Brown wants to be on the outside, using his length to chip away at you, to react to what you're doing, to pick you off with those long punches, those range-finding kicks. And Jack Della Maddalena wants to take control of the centre of the octagon, walk you down, and pressure you to fight in an uncomfortable range. So this fight's an interesting one because both guys are going to get what they want. Madalena is going to want to walk Randy Brown down, pressure him into the cage, and, bait him into exchanging with him. We know Madalena is the kind of guy that likes to bet on his chin, his toughness, his power against yours. And we know Randy Brown's the kind of guy that's not going to want to play that game. He's not going to want to get into any big exchanges with Madalena. He's going to want to stay on the outside, circle away, and like I say, pick Madalena off with volume strikes without getting into any big exchanges. And so when we look at how these two match up stylistically, we know that Madalena can take a shot better than Brown. He's got a very good chin. He's very durable. He fights at a high pace. We have seen Randy Brown get rocked, dropped, wobbled many times throughout his career. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say his chin is getting better, but what I would definitely say is that his ability to read his opponent is getting better. And so it's far more difficult to get inside and land clean and hard on Brown than it used to be. And that's obviously helped by his footwork, his movement, his length, his reach. He does a really, really good job of making himself a difficult target to hit. However, Madalena is one of these guys that doesn't mind eating a shot to get inside and land one of his own. And he's tough enough to take a shot to get inside, and he's very, very aggressive. So when you look at Brown in his fights where he has successfully used counter-striking strategies to pick guys off like Chaos Williams and Jared Gooden from the outside, Randy Brown looked absolutely phenomenal, achieving his goal of counter-striking against both guys and, playing the role of Matador. However, I do feel that was largely helped by the fact that both Williams and Gooden aren't high-volume strikers. They're more the type of striker that will, for the most part, either blitz you, with one singular big attack where they uncork like a 3-4 strike combination and then they'll ease off for maybe 30-40 seconds before throwing again, or they'll just load up on big singular power strikes. And while that type of striker that commits so hard to their attacks, so hard to their power punches, is difficult and dangerous to deal with, taking nothing away from Randy Brown, he's a brilliant striker. But what I would say is that it is far more difficult to stay on the outside and counter-strike a guy like Madalena, who not only brings that ability to cover distance quickly, land big impactful damaging strikes that can knock you out, but he also brings those threats with good cardio and also a much higher volume than the likes of Gooden and Williams. And that's really what makes this one interesting. Madalena may have trouble getting inside on Brown initially, but he's very persistent and very aggressive with his pressure fighting style. Will he eventually get to the point where he's just able to walk through Brown's shots and start to light him up like we've seen him do, to quite a few guys throughout his career? Obviously, none of them were as good as Randy Brown at counter-striking, but this is a really tricky test stylistically for Madalena, and I'm interested to see how he does. So, earlier in the breakdown for this fight, I spoke about how I felt initially Madalena would have been close to a lock in this matchup, and then when I researched it, I started to give Randy Brown much more of a chance of winning this one than I thought I would. And the reason why I kind of changed my opinion was mostly down to one fight, which was Jack Della Maddalena versus Ange Looser on the Contender Series. And this fight stands out to me, and it's very significant for a few reasons. The first one being, it's one of the very few fights where we've seen Madalena go deep into the matchup. As you can see, the vast majority of his fights have ended in round 1 or have ended quite soon into round 2. And so this was really the only fight over the last few years where we've got a good look at Madalena to gauge how he's going to look going into the second and third round. And what I found in that Lusa fight was that in round 1, Madalena doesn't look a whole lot different to how he's looked in his 3 fights in the UFC. He's sharp, he's fast, he's aggressive, he's technical. But what I noticed with Madalena is very similar to what I noticed when doing research on Yair Rodriguez this week, in that as you go into the second and third round, he becomes a lot flatter. I'm not saying he gasses, same as I'm not saying Yair Rodriguez gasses. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they become flatter. And when a guy like Madalena becomes flatter, he becomes a little slower, a little bit more predictable, a little easier to hit. His volume drops a little, and he doesn't have as much pop on his shots, which means he becomes a lot more beatable. When you look at Randy Brown, one of his biggest strengths is his cardio. This guy just doesn't slow down. The version of Randy Brown you get in the first minute of a fight is really not all that different from the version you get from him in like the 14th minute of the fight. He's a cardio machine. And so while I do think Brown will struggle with the power and the physicality of Madalena early on, I could see a situation where if Madalena does start to slow a little in the second round, you could really start to see momentum swing in Brown's favour, and he could really start to pepper Madalena with his volume strikes and rack up big volume. And that would make this fight, I think, very competitive in the second half of this matchup. But how this fight plays out and how competitive it's likely to be, for me, comes down to 2 things. The first thing is whether Brown can weather the early storm. Because like we were saying earlier on, throughout his career, he does have a habit of getting rocked, dropped and wobbled, which is unfortunately quite a common characteristic of someone who's abnormally long and tall for their division. Brown at 6'3" is absolutely massive for the division, so it's no surprise that he does get dinged a lot. It's just a common trait. There are a few unicorns, like a John Jones, but they are few and far between. Guys like Randy Brown, who are abnormally long and tall for their division, usually do get dinged quite a lot and don't have the best chins for their division. So we know Madalena is going to come out the gate very hard, very aggressive, not show Brown any respect, and look to bait him into big exchanges and look to try and engage in a brawl. We know he's going to do this because he always does this, and he's probably going to be amped up from the crowd, the atmosphere, the crazy Aussie fans getting behind him and supporting him. So Brown is going to have to walk through the fire early on. And I'm not sure if he can do it because Madalena is very, very dangerous. But based on the Ange Lusa fight, if Brown can make it out of round 1, I do think things can get very interesting in rounds 2 and 3. But that only depends on one more factor. And the other factor is whether Madalena is going to perform like he did against Lusa if the fight goes deep. And this is where, what I said earlier on in the breakdown comes into play, where when you've got a guy like Madalena, who we know is young, hungry, motivated, working very hard and improving, we know it's very likely he's going to be making big improvements from fight to fight. I'm sure he's a very smart guy. We know he's very ambitious. And so when you look at his career leading into that Contender Series fight, you can see that he smoked pretty much everyone that he ever fought after his first 2 pro fights. Him looking a little bit flat in the second and third round of the Lusa fight may have been an adrenaline dump. It may have been octagon jitters. It may have been just not really knowing how to pace himself across a 3-round fight, because he hadn't been 3 rounds in a competitive matchup before. But But after feeling what it's like to go 3 hard rounds against a reasonably, skilled opponent like Angelusa, I'm sure that Madalena learned a hell of a lot from that performance on the Contender Series. And on top of that, it was a very long time ago. It was back in September 2021. So there's so much time and so much scope for someone like Madalena to have improved since then. So it's tough for us to feel confident that he will slow down into the second and third rounds, because we're really forming an opinion based on one fight that took place quite a long time ago. And what I would say is that if Madalena is able to fight at a high pace for 3 rounds, it is going to be a difficult fight for Brown, because while he is a very skilled, counter striker, Madalena has the pressure, the aggression, the volume, and the power and powerful and impactful strikes to go with it. And with home advantage on his side, I just think it's going to be really difficult for Brown to outpoint Madalena from the outside. It's going to be a very difficult thing to do if Madalena can keep up a high pace for 3 rounds. I think Brown's only chance of winning this is catching Madalena with something crazy on the ground. A flash knockout, which can always happen, especially when you're as reckless as Madalena is, although his chin does look very good. Or, like I say, if Madalena slows a bit in the second and third like he did against Angelusa, and then Brown can really start to do what he does best. And, start to pepper his opponents and rack up that big volume. So that's how I see this one going. What does that mean from a betting point of view, to summarise? Well, as much as I love Madalena in this fight, I think he's a brilliant fighter. I do think he wins a very high percentage of the time. I think his advantages are pretty much baked into the odds, with his odds carrying an implied probability of 78%. I'm not going to be betting this fight this weekend, but if you want to bet it, I do think Randy Brown gives you the better risk to reward ratio. He could submit Madalena, he could knock him out with how reckless Madalena is, and if Madalena does slow in the second and third round, I think Brown can take over and backdoor a decision. It won't be easy though, and be absolutely sure here, Madalena is much more likely to win. A decent percentage of the time. I just don't like his odds. So if we take a look at the over-under on this one, we can see that fight goes to a decision. So this is quite an interesting situation. So this is one of those situations where, if you were to ask me, Chris, the fight between Jack Della Maddalena and Randy Brown, do you think is more likely to go the distance or end inside the distance? I would say to you, this one's more likely to end inside the distance. Madalena pushes the action, forces people to exchange. He's very dangerous, but he also, because he's so dangerous and aggressive, he also puts himself in a position to be finished. This fight's more likely not to go to a decision. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the best bet, because if we look at the odds, 1.50 minus 200, implied probability is 67%. It's one of those situations where you're not getting a particularly good risk to reward ratio on that. Is the fight more likely to end inside the distance? Yes, but you'd have to cap it at like 70% to, find any value in those odds. So this is one of those situations where, even though I do think it's more likely the fight doesn't go to a decision, betting on the fight to go to a decision at dog odds probably gives you the better risk to reward ratio, because what we do know is that both guys are very tough. We also know Brown is probably going to be trying to avoid getting into any big exchanges. And we also know that if Madalena does slow down in rounds 2 and 3 like he did against Angelusa, then it becomes significantly less likely he'll get a finish in this fight, because it'll be much easier for Brown to kind of evade his strikes and, not get himself knocked out. On top of that, we've also seen Brown go the distance against heavy hitters like Francisco Trinaldo, Chaos Williams, Jared Gooden. It's not easy to get to Brown these days and knock him out. And Madalena's a tough guy. Brown, for the most part, is a volume striker. So if Brown can make it out the first round, I think there is a pretty good chance it goes the distance. So I'm not going to be betting on the over-under on this one. I don't see a really strong position to put my money on either side. but the over probably gives you the better risk to reward ratio at dog odds, even though I don't love it. Now, in terms of the prop bets for this one, Madalena by knockout is the most obvious prop, but the odds are really steep. I mean, you're not even getting plus 100 in the odds on that. So, I mean, for me, that's a very bad bet. People sometimes misunderstand me when I say things like that. When I say that's a really bad bet, I think Madalena to win by knockout at TKO is the most likely outcome. But you're betting on a really specific outcome at even money odds. And for me, that just it doesn't give you the best risk to reward ratio. I don't see value there. So the other props I would look at, is quite a lot you could do here. Perhaps Brown by decision, 6.0 plus 500. Brown by submission, 14.0 plus 1,300. That's very wide. Obviously not that likely to win, but a nice long shot prop bet you might want to take a look at. You know, there's a few options there. Even to be fair, even Brown to win by knockout at TKO, purely because we know Madalena is the kind of guy that loves to get into big exchanges. He loves to bait his opponents into playing rock'em sock'em robots. It only takes one clean hard shot to land to knock you out. So, Brown to win by knockout at TKO, there's a few props for you to think about there. Now let's break down the next fight. So, now let's get into talking about the fight between Justin Tafa and Parker Porter. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that both guys are in the even money odds range. At the moment, we've got Parker Porter as the slight underdog of odds of around 2.05, which is plus 105 for an implied probability of 49%. And Justin Tafa as the slight favourite at odds of around 1.80, which is minus 125 for an implied probability of 56%. So earlier this week, when I started researching the fights, Parker Porter was one of the first names that jumped out at me as a potential bet. And I've made money betting on Parker Porter before. And I think it's because Parker Porter is one of these guys that I do feel gets overlooked a lot because of his appearance. Parker Porter has a lot of the attributes that make him a tough opponent for a lot of guys at heavyweight. But because of his appearance, his body type, I feel people underrate him a little bit and discredit him a little bit for some things that he does particularly well that a lot of heavyweights don't do that well. And so earlier on in the week, I bet Parker Porter, and ever since his odds have been steadily declining. You can see, since Monday when I shared the bet with my community, his odds have been steadily declining. So this is one of those fights where I feel there is a big element to this matchup which is not factored into the odds at all. And that's why there's a lot of value on Porter. Similar to, a few weeks ago when I recommended a bet on Jamal Hill against Glover Teixeira, the reason why there was so much value on Jamal Hill is because the odds makers and the betting public didn't realize that it was going to be extremely difficult for Glover to take Hill down and hold him down based on past performances. With this matchup, I feel both guys being in the even money odds range is based on if this were absolutely 100% going to be a stand-up fight. So if you came to me and you said, Chris, I've got a crystal ball, I can see into the future, I'm telling you right now, Justin Tafa versus Parker Porter is going to be a stand-up fight. These guys are just going to stand and strike. How would you cap the fight if this were a stand-up fight? And I would probably cap the fight pretty much how these odds are set. I would have probably Tafa as a slight favourite, and I would have Porter as a very slight underdog. But if I were absolutely sure that this were going to be a stand-up fight, I would have both guys in the even money odds range. But this is a mixed martial arts contest, not a boxing match. And Parker Porter has an absolutely enormous advantage over Justin Tafa on the ground based on past performances. And for that reason, I feel these odds are very badly off. And if I were to cap this fight, I would have Parker Porter probably as like a 1.6, 1.7 favourite, something like that, which would be around a minus 154 favourite. Like I say, if this fight stays standing, Tafa's probably got a slight edge. But with the potential for Porter to grapple in this one, these odds are way off, and Porter should be the favourite, which is why I think his odds are steadily declining, because as more people research this fight, they're starting to see the same thing that I saw. Now, even though these two guys are in the same odds range as Jamal Hill and Glover Teixeira, I was extremely confident that Jamal Hill was going to win that fight, because I knew Glover would find it very difficult to take Hill down and hold him down, and I knew if the fight stayed standing, Glover would most likely get absolutely smoked. I don't feel as confident in Porter for a few reasons. First reason being, it's a heavyweight. And we know Justin Tafa hits hard. We know Porter is slow and not the best defensively. If Tafa lands a bomb at any time in the fight, he can knock Porter out. There's no doubt about it. On top of that, Porter's not the best grappler. So it's hard to have a high degree of conviction and confidence in his ability to use a grappling heavy game plan to win this fight, because his grappling isn't great. And on top of that, we don't absolutely know if Parker Porter will use a grappling heavy game plan in this matchup. He has, in his recent fights against Alan Baudo, used a bit of grappling against Chase Sherman as well. But fighters often use bad game plans, bad strategies, and Porter may get stubborn, refuse to grapple in this one, try and win a kickboxing match, and get outstruck. He might not be able to get Tafa down. Who knows? So my level of confidence on Porter isn't high this weekend. But this is one of those situations where I feel the odds are clearly very inaccurate. And as a result, I've got to take the value on Porter, even though I don't feel that confident in him. And I think what's happened with the odds on this fight is very similar to what happened with the odds on Tybura versus Ivanov last week. If you watched last week's videos, you'll know that I recommended a bet on Marcin Tybura. He was a strong lean in that fight. And the reason being, I don't think Tybura's advantages on the ground were baked into the odds. If you look at the odds, they were in the even money odds range. And the odds were set on what the fight probably should have been capped at if it were going to be a stand-up fight. But we know that Tybura had a huge advantage over Ivanov on the ground. And as a result, that should have more heavily swayed the odds in Tybura's favour. And we all saw the third round where Tybura got Ivanov down easily and dominated him on the ground in round 3. And I feel the odds makers have made the same mistake in setting the odds on this fight, and the public just haven't corrected it yet, although we are starting to see the odds correct with the odds on Porter declining. So let's now get a little bit more specific as to the reasons why I do think there's a good amount of value on Parker Porter. So as I kicked off the breakdown for this fight, I spoke about certain attributes Parker Porter has got which make him a tough opponent for a lot of guys in the heavyweight division, but a fighter that I feel does get overlooked a lot because his record isn't great and his appearance is something that people kind of like to make fun of. But when you look at Parker Porter and what he brings to the table, he's got very good cardio for a heavyweight. Of course, naturally, he does slow a little bit as fights wear on, but Porter tends to slow due to the high volume and high pace that he fights at. So it's not like Porter just slows down because he gets tired and gassed. He slows down through working really hard. And the benefit of that is, because he works so hard, he forces his opponents to react to what he's doing. So they often slow down a lot more than he does. So over a heavyweight, Porter's got really good cardio. He's very tough He's got a good chin. Of course, he's been knocked out a few times. What heavyweight hasn't? But for the most part, he could take a shot. He's tough. He's not easy to get out of there. On top of that, he's got decent boxing. Sure, he'll eat shots from time to time. He's a little bit slow. He's very comfortable at boxing. There's far worse boxers in the division than Parker Porter. On top of that, he is one of these guys that just fights at a very high volume. Porter is one of these guys that is always working, always doing something. He's always pumping the jab, shooting a takedown, grinding on you in the clinch. He just doesn't go away. He's annoying for opponents because he just doesn't let them off the hook. He's just constantly working, constantly pushing a pace. And there are very few heavyweights that can actually do that successfully and effectively for 15 minutes. But Porter can. There's a lot of things that he does well, which not many heavyweights can do well. And so he is a little bit of a sleeper. I do think he is a bit underrated. Of course, he's never going to be a top heavyweight at the stage in his career he's at, 37 years old. But he's a tough test for a lot of heavyweights. And I believe he is going to be a tough test for Justin Tafa this weekend. So if we go through the tail of the tape very quickly, Porter's 37 years old. He's going to be 38 years old in April, which is only a couple months away now. He's 6 foot tall with a 75-inch reach. Tafa, 29 years old, 6 foot tall with a 74-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same size, but there is a big difference in age. Porter, pretty much 9 years older than Tafa, which statistically means Tafa wins around 70% of the time. So the younger fighter wins around 70% of the time when there's a 9-year age gap in a fight. Having said that, Porter hasn't really shown any signs of decline. And 38 years old is old for sure. But we know fighters in the heavier weight classes, like the heavyweight division, tend to not decline as early on in their career as fighters that are in lighter weight classes. So we're talking about, Josh Emmett being 38 years old. 38 years old for a featherweight is very, very old. 38 years old for a heavyweight, nowhere near as bad. But with Justin Tafa being 29 years old, exactly what we said with Madalena, he should be making big improvements from fight to fight. Now, when you look at how these two match up stylistically, they are both primarily strikers. And they've got very, very different styles of striking. Tafa is one of these guys that he's more of a sniper. So he tends to load up on big singular power strikes. But he doesn't throw that many strikes per round. If you go and watch Tafa's past fights, gone a bit blurry, go back and watch Tafa's past fights, he tends to only land, 10 to 15 strikes per round, which is quite a low volume. So Tafa definitely has a lot more power than Porter. But what I really like about Porter is his volume. He doesn't pack anywhere near as much of a punch as Tafa, but he's always working. He's always pumping the jab in your face, chipping away at you, throwing leg kicks, trying to drive you into the cage and grind on you. Parker's always trying to outpoint you, which I really like in a matchup like this, because with Tafa's volume being low, if Tafa doesn't knock Porter out, with how low Tafa's volume is, it's going to be very difficult for Tafa to win a decision, because Porter is very likely to outwork him and outpoint him. Now, of course, that is nuanced, right? If Tafa were to score knockdowns in 2 out of the 3 rounds, or inflict loads of damage with the fewer strikes that he does land, then obviously Tafa can win a decision that way. But for the most part, outside of that happening in a kickboxing match, Porter is very likely to outstrike Tafa in terms of volume. And while Tafa will likely land the harder, more impactful shots, Porter packs a punch too. He could for sure hurt Tafa on the feet. There's no doubt about it. Now, if the fight stays standing, for the reasons I just described, I do see it as very close to a 50-50 matchup. You could give Tafa the slight edge, but ultimately this is power versus volume, and it's kind of difficult to work out, what's going to come out on top there. But if the fight does stay standing, if no one gets knocked out, if it goes the distance, I think it'll have been a competitive fight. I don't see either of these guys outclassing the other on the feet. So while we think the fight is likely going to be competitive if it stays standing, it is a whole different ball game if this fight goes to the ground. Now, I was discussing this fight with someone in my community a couple of days ago. Shout out to you, Ghoul. We were talking about Porter's path to victory in this fight as being grappling. And Ghoul said Porter's grappling sucks. And it is a very literal statement. And it's one that I can't argue against. I'm not going to sit here and say Porter's grappling is great. Porter's going to go out there and fucking Makhachev Tafa's ass off. I can't say that. But what I would say about how these two match up stylistically is whenever we've seen Tafa's grappling, it has looked so bad that Parker Porter's grappling doesn't need to be that much better than Tafa's to have a giant advantage on the ground. And based on what we've seen in past fights, I believe the skill gap between these two on the ground is it's like they're galaxies apart on the ground. And I'll show you a little bit of footage in a minute just to back that up. But I do want to address the point that I'm sure some people are going to make in the comments about the fact that Parker Porter tried to use a grappling heavy game plan against Alan Baudo and didn't have tons of success with it. Now, again, I'm not going to sit here and say those guys are wrong, but I do think it's important that we identify the styles make fights. And just because Porter struggled to get Baudo down and hold him down does not mean he will struggle to get Tafa down and hold him down. Because we've got to consider the background of these two guys and their skill set. If you think about where Alan Baudo trains, he's coming out the MMA Factory stable of fighters with guys like Nazardine Imavov, Cyril Gan, Francis Ngannou. Now, I know that Baudo is nowhere near the level of those three fighters, but what do all the fighters have in common that I just mentioned? Well, they're all kind of difficult to take down, and they all use the cage to great effect when defending takedowns. And Baudo's no different. He's got a long, lean frame, a nice wide base, and he's really, really good at using the cage to keep fights standing. He's got great balance in those positions. And the problem with Porter is that most of his takedowns come from the clinch position. So he'll drive his opponent into the cage, then he'll start working for the takedown. And because Baudo is so good at using the cage to defend the takedown, it is very difficult to upset his balance. Now, yes, we did see Josh Parisian take Baudo, beat him up on the ground. And Parisian is a very low-level grappler as well. But it is worth noting that Baudo was pretty tired before Parisian started to hit easy takedowns on him. And Parisian did fully commit to getting in deep on the legs and hips of Baudo to drag him down. And, we saw Porter eventually get Baudo down as well. So it's one of those situations where I do understand that Porter's performances recently, where he's used grappling heavy game plans, have not painted his grappling in a particularly good light. I do get it, totally. But the footage that I'm about to show you should have you questioning whether it even matters. Because from my perspective, Tafa's takedown defense and ground game has looked so bad that any able-bodied professional mixed martial artist in the heavyweight division is going to have a great chance of potentially exploiting the weakness in Tafa's skill set, which is his ground game. And again, you've always got to consider the risk to reward ratio we're getting in the odds. If this fight were to stay standing, if there was no chance that Porter would be able to use grappling to win this fight, I still don't think Porter is a terrible bet at slight dog odds, because in a stand-up fight, power versus volume, I think it'll be competitive. Tafa might have the slight edge, but your money is not dead in the water. It's not like Porter has no chance of winning a stand-up fight. He could. the fact that there is the potential for Porter to absolutely dominate this fight and make light work of Tafa with a grappling heavy game plan just makes it so obvious to me, if you're interpreting probabilities correctly, that Porter is giving you a fantastic risk to reward ratio this weekend. But please do your own research. I'm just an idiot on the internet. Do not take my word for it. Go look into all these fights that I've mentioned yourself, form your own opinion. But before we move on, I do want to show you some evidence to back up my criticisms of Tafa's takedown defense and ground game. And I don't like to be disrespectful or detrimental to a fighter's skill set, because Tafa 10 times the man I will ever be. But it's my job to identify good value bets and try to make money betting on MMA. And when I see a really good opportunity, I've got to give you guys the best explanation as to why I feel that is such a good opportunity. And being brutally honest and showing you guys footage is the best way to do that. So Tafa's actually hit an outside trip on this guy, Tumo Pao. And he's kind of working from top position. Eventually he loses top position. And in a moment we're going to see Tafa's takedown offense and the ground game. So here you can see Tafa's kind of attacking with the choke, but that just results in him giving his opponent an opportunity to get in on his legs and hips and hit his own takedown. We can see Tafa here hesitating a little bit before standing back up against the cage. There you can see Tao Mao Piu gets in on the legs. Hasn't flattened Tafa out yet, but he's threatening with it. So Tafa back up now. And in a moment we're going to get our first glimpse at Tafa's full-on takedown defense, or lack of it. Skip ahead a little bit. Don't want this video to drag on. So here you can see Tao Mao Piu has got full control of Tafa's body, and he's able to use that to turn it into an outside trip, straight into top position. So now we get to see a little bit of Tafa off his back and his ability to work his way back up to his feet. So here you can see he's kind of mounted, but not really, because the cage is making it difficult for Tao Mao Piu to flatten him out. But then he does flatten him out. The cage still makes it difficult to take mount, so he goes back to half guard. But now we can just kind of see Tafa looking pretty low level off his back. Just allows Tao Mao Piu to stay in this kind of half guard position and just chip away at him with his ground and pound. And what shows that Tafa is pretty low level from this position is that he actually has tons of space on the bottom. It's not like Tao Mao Piu has been able to flatten him out, get into top position, stay heavy and tight to him from top position. That's not the case at all. You can see Tafa's able to create space for himself off his back with his legs. He's able to move around a lot on the bottom, but he just doesn't come close to working his way back up to his feet, doesn't attempt to work his way back up to his feet. And even when he was quite tight to the cage, he just didn't appear to know how to wall walk. And so inevitably, he ends up getting flattened out in the middle of the octagon. Now his opponent's in half guard, raining down ground and pound. And we can see Tafa looking super duper duper weak off his back. And we'll just continue skipping through, speed the video up. But you can see Tafa just looking absolutely clueless off his back. Reminds me a lot of Tai Tuivasa, actually, where we know Tuivasa is a great striker. He's game, he's scrappy, he's tough, he's mean, he's nasty. He's got devastating knockout power. But if you put Tuivasa on his back, he has absolutely no idea how to defend himself. And we can see, in this first round, Tafa gave up a very, very weak takedown, fell into that trip, went down easily, and then just basically spent the rest of the round on his back, not knowing how to defend himself, not knowing how to work his way back up to his feet. And this is really significant because while Parker Porter may not be the best grappler, may not be the best offensive wrestler, he does actively look to take his opponents down. And with how easily Tafa gave up that takedown, Porter probably isn't going to have to work that hard to get Tafa to the ground. And one thing that I think we can all agree on when it comes to Parker Porter is that he's got a very heavy top game and very good grappling control. if he does get this fight to the ground and he does get on top of Tafa, it is going to be very difficult for Tafa to find a way to work his way back up to his feet, which will obviously, increase the probability of Porter winning this fight tremendously. But it goes even deeper than that. We've already said that Tafa is a sniper. He likes to load up on big single power strikes, and he doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes per round. So what's huge about Porter's persistence in using grappling is that if he does get Tafa down and he does spend a few minutes on top of Tafa, beating him up from top position, forcing Tafa to carry his body weight and fight off the bottom like that is really going to tire Tafa out and accelerate the rate at which he slows down, which will then make him far less dangerous on the feet, far less capable of landing a knockout shot, and also reduce the volume he throws when he already throws a pretty low volume. So I love Parker Porter in this fight. I think the odds are way off. I think there's a ton of value in Porter's odds, but ultimately these two guys hit very hard. Porter is there to be hit. We've seen him knocked out in the past. He has a lot of weaknesses that Tafa could potentially exploit, and his grappling isn't the best. So I'm not saying Porter is likely to win a super high percentage of the time. I'm not saying I feel really confident Porter is going to win. All I am saying is that I think there's tons of value in his odds, just like there were on Jamal Hill a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully Porter gets the job done for me, and I would urge you, if you're betting this fight this weekend, to do your research, because it's an interesting one to dig into. One of the most interesting fights on this card, in my opinion. So if we take a look at the over-under on this one, similar odds on the over-under to what we saw in the Madalena Randy Brown fight, where the most likely outcome, again, in my opinion, is this fight doesn't go to a decision, because I think if the fight does go to the ground, there's a good chance Porter gets a stoppage with how bad Tafa is at defending himself. And if the fight does stay standing, both guys hit pretty hard. Neither of them are particularly good defensively. Chance for a knockout is quite high. The odds are quite steep, but if you do want to bet on, the over-under here, I would definitely go with the under. I do think it's quite unlikely that this one goes to a decision. Now, in terms of prop bets for this one, it is tricky, because if you look at Porter's record, he doesn't really have too many wins by submission. So if he were to use a grappling heavy game plan and get a stoppage on the ground, I do feel it would be more than likely through ground and pound, where he would just kind of wear Tafa down to the point where Tafa's too tired to defend himself on the ground. I'm not ruling out a submission, but I do think most likely outcome is Porter to win by knockout or TKO. So if you were going to bet a prop on this, I would go with Porter to win by knockout or TKO in that 5.0 plus 400 odds range, because that covers the possibility of Porter straight up knocking Tafa out on the feet, or getting a stoppage on the ground with ground and pound, which would also be classified as a win through knockout or TKO. So I quite like that prop. I would go with that one. And that is it for that fight. But obviously, let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I'm misreading this fight? Do you think I'm making a mistake on this one? Let me know what you think. And yeah, I'm interested to get your thoughts. I read all the comments. I really appreciate all of them. Now let's get into the next fight, which is going to be Jimmy Crute against Alonzo Menifield. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Jimmy Crute is the favourite at average odds of around 1.53, which is going to be minus 189 for an implied probability of 65%. We take a look at the odds on his opponent, Alonzo Menifield. He is around an average of 2.55, which is going to be plus 155 for an implied probability of 39%. So Jimmy Crute is 26 years old, 6'2", with a 74-inch reach. And Alonzo Menifield, 35 years old, 6 foot tall, with a 76-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same size, but we can see that Menifield is 9 years older than Crute, which statistically gives Crute around about a 70% chance of winning. Now, having said that, Menifield isn't showing any signs of decline. You know, if anything, he's getting better. He's only had 16 pro fights, 35 years old, not particularly old for a light heavyweight. Having said that, with Crute only being 26 years old, we should see big improvements from him from fight to fight. You would expect Crute to be improving at an exponential rate. So while you wouldn't expect to see Menifield decline, Crute could show up looking better than ever this weekend, and I would certainly expect him to. Now, the problem with this matchup is that it's a very difficult one to get a read on because of two reasons which make it very difficult to know what to expect from both fighters this weekend. The first reason why it's difficult to get a strong read on this matchup is because Alonzo Menifield is very inconsistent. When you look at Menifield, he's really the total package. He's got, you know, crazy power, crazy athleticism, decent cardio. He moves very well on the feet, nice technical striking, good takedown defense, decent grappling. When you look at a guy like Menifield, from a technical point of view, he really doesn't have many weaknesses to speak of. He's very solid everywhere. He's a very well-rounded fighter. But Menifield lacks in the one area of MMA which is probably the most important, which is the mental game. And Menifield is one of these guys that is just incredibly inconsistent. It always feels with Menifield like it's 50-50 whether he's going to show up and perform to his full potential. At times he shows up and looks like a potential champion, and then at other times we see him and he just doesn't perform. You know, he makes bad decisions, uses bad strategies, makes mistakes in fights, or he's too gun shy. I don't know if it's performance anxiety or, you know, I don't know what it is with Menifield, but he's a very inconsistent fighter, and because of that, it's very difficult to predict the outcome of his fights because, you know, half the time he's going to show up like a world champion and run through someone like Jimmy Crute, and then the other half of the time he's going to suffer from performance anxiety, not perform well, and, you know, struggle really, really bad. So that makes it difficult to read Alonzo Menifield. But Jimmy Crute is also a very difficult fighter to read because if we take a look at his record, we can see that there's barely any footage available on this guy, which is a crazy thing to say considering he's been fighting in the UFC for almost 5 years. But if we look at his record, we can see that pretty much every single one of his fights in the UFC has ended in round 1. So we really don't know that much about Jimmy Crute. The last time we saw him go deep in a fight was almost 5 years ago against Paul Craig, all the way back in 2018. Every single one of his fights since then has ended very, very quickly in round 1, which gives us a problem from a handicapping perspective because we've got no idea how Crute is going to look in the second and third rounds of this fight. Back when he went deep against Paul Craig and also against... it was just Paul Craig. Back when he went deep against Paul Craig in his UFC debut, he did slow down a lot as the fight wore on and his cardio looked very bad. But that was his debut. He was young, he was inexperienced, probably didn't know how to pace himself over 3 rounds, may have adrenaline dumped. His cardio may look a lot better now with all these years of experience behind him. But we don't know either way because every single one of his fights since then has ended so quickly. So Crute is, for me, a bit of an unknown because while we can talk about his level of striking and grappling based on what we've seen, we've got to make a lot of assumptions because our judgments are based on fleeting moments in fights that just haven't lasted very long. And as a result, it's a very difficult fight to predict, this one. What I'm going to do is talk about how these two match up stylistically based on what we've seen in terms of their entire body of work. But what I really need to drive home to you guys and emphasize is that the statements that I'm going to be making, the information that I'm going to be sharing with you, is not reliable due to Menifield's inconsistency and a lack of footage on Crute. But based on their entire body of work, I would expect Crute to slow down quite a lot if this fight progresses. Ultimately, his cardio looked very bad the one time we saw him go past round 1, and as a result, that's all we've got to work with. You'd expect his cardio to look bad in this fight as well. Now, Menifield slows down a little bit as fights wear on, but nowhere near as much as Crute did against Paul Craig. And so I think the longer this fight goes, the better it gets for Menifield. However, Jimmy Crute does have home advantage on his side. He's a wild, young, hungry, aggressive guy. He's probably going to feed off the energy of the crowd, and perhaps the energy of the crowd, you know, the crazy fans in Australia, perhaps they will make Alonzo Menifield's performance anxiety even worse and throw Menifield off his game. Where we talk about Menifield being inconsistent, you know, I'm sure that the passionate Australian fans aren't going to help him overcome that and deal with that on Saturday night. I'm sure they're going to make it a lot harder than, you know, if he were to fight in essentially a TV studio, which is the Contender Series, the Apex Center. So you would expect, based on past performances, Crute to struggle as the fight progressed and Menifield to take over. However, the atmosphere could drive Crute on and energize him, and lead to crippling performance anxiety for Menifield. In terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, Crute is one of these guys that has, for the most part, a kicks-based style of striking. He's a better kicker than he is a boxer. Menifield is a better boxer than a kicker. But the real difference between these two is that Crute is a lot more aggressive, throws a much higher volume of strikes. Menifield is one of these guys that likes to pick you off with accurate, big, singular power strikes, whereas Crute just likes to overwhelm you and brawl with a really high volume of strikes. Both guys are there to be hit. Both guys are there to be dinged. Both guys are kind of vulnerable in exchanges. And so I do think there's a pretty good chance we're going to see one of these guys get knocked out, because the way Crute fights, with how aggressive he is, kind of forces guys to engage. And when he does that, something's got to give. You know, both guys are going to be putting themselves in danger of being knocked out. And both these guys are very dangerous. They both have true, legit one-shot knockout power. Now, in terms of how these two match up on the ground, Menifield is a really solid MMA grappler. He's got good takedown defense, a heavy top game. His weakness is that he isn't great off his back, but because he's a strong MMA grappler with good takedown defense, it's not easy to put him on his back in the first place. Now, Crute is one of these guys that doesn't understand the importance of position over submission. So Crute is one of these guys that's constantly attacking with submissions on the ground, but because of that, he often gives up position a lot, winds up on the bottom, and also quite often don't necessarily take high percentage plays. So it's worked out for him up until this point in his career, where, you know, he has racked up some submission wins, but as he starts to face a higher level of opponent and he starts, you know, giving up position to jump on attacking these aggressive submission attempts, you will start to see guys defend those submissions and make him pay and put him in bad positions on the ground. Also, based on the Paul Craig fight, Crute is a guy that tends to gas quite quickly if you make him grapple. But again, we're just basing our opinion on one fight, so not all that reliable. So yeah, I don't have a particularly strong read on this one, guys. What I'm really hoping for is that this one goes deep. I'm hoping this fight goes the distance, and I'm hoping we get a good look at Jimmy Crute. Because if one of these guys gets knocked out in 2 minutes of the first round, next time Jimmy Crute fights, we're going to be in exactly the same position where we really don't know what to expect from him. So what does this mean for over-unders? So if we take a look at the odds on the over-under, we can see that, no surprise, fight not to go to a decision is heavy favourite odds. So those odds don't get me excited at all. But because both guys are very bad defensively, because both guys are very dangerous offensively, and because Jimmy Crute is an aggressive guy that forces his opponent to engage, this fight is very, very likely not to go to a decision. So I don't like the odds on either side here. I think that you're better off giving the over-under a miss on this fight. I don't see a strong position on either side there. Now, in terms of prop bets, I do think most likely outcome is either of these guys winning by knockout. Menifield is the more technical, accurate striker, but Crute is the more aggressive kind of vicious striker. Like, he's got the dog in him. So, pick your poison, really. Whoever you think is more likely to win this fight. If you want a better prop, take them to win by knockout or TKO. Someone's probably getting knocked out in this fight just due to a lack of footage on Crute and Menifield's inconsistency. Makes it difficult to feel confident either way, which way that is going to go. So, hope you found that breakdown useful. That is going to be it for this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button below. If this video gets 150 likes, I'll be dropping a breakdown video for the fight between Jake Paul and Tommy Fury. Subscribe if you haven't already. And don't forget to check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. Live betting spaces currently available. Get breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card in the pre-fight betting tips section as well. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, everybody, and I will see you in next week's video. Nice one, guys. Bye.